Okay, so let me introduce our second speaker today, and which is Dr. Alexandra Fiocco. And she is the associate professor in psychology at Ryerson University. And I have a lot in common with Dr. Fiocco because we both are interested in doing research with aging populations. So Dr. Fiocco focuses on the health perspective and how to help older adults to lead a healthy life. So she's mainly interested about lifestyle behaviors and what can older adults do to maintain cognitive health and well-being in late life. And my perspective is a little bit different, but we have overlap. So that's why I feel like we are connected, right? And she's also a qualified mindfulness-based stress reduction teacher, and she is running our Mindful community, which is a virtual weekly mindful session for older adults and to teach older adults mindfulness and also practice with older adults and help them to cope with COVID-19. So her topic today is coping with COVID-19, building resilience during a time of uncertainty. So please join me to welcome Dr. Fiocco. So Alex, you can share your screen.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction, Leisha. Can you see the screen now?
No.
Oh, let's see. Oh,
here you are.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
And is it the full screen or is it the screen with, like, do you see one slide deck?
I see one slide. I think it depends on the setup of their monitor.
Okay, all right. So hopefully you can see the slide nice and clearly. So thank you so much, Leisha, for that introduction. And thank you all for being here with us tonight and for attending this webinar. So as Leisha mentioned, I am going to speak about coping with COVID-19 and particular talking about the stress that may arise during this pandemic and even outside of the pandemic, as well as how we may be able to build resilience using mindfulness meditation. So let me just go here. Okay, all right. So this is just a roadmap for my talk this evening. And so I'll begin by talking about the stress response and what stress looks like in the body when it arises, and then some of the negative impact that chronic stress may have on the mind and brain. I'll then talk about identifying the ingredients to stress, and those ingredients may look a little different for each and every one of us. And then I'll talk about mindfulness meditation and how this is a tool that we can use to help us cultivate resilience. And then I will talk about the benefits of mindfulness meditation that's been shown in the research. And then we will revisit those ingredients to stress and apply some of the mindful attitudes to those ingredients. And then I'll end with with a 4-step practice that we may be able to use when we're feeling a little overwhelmed during the day. So before I talk about stress, it's always important to sort of understand the concept of homeostasis. So our body has this built-in regulatory system that ensures that our body maintains balance. And our regulatory system works for us without any conscious effort. And this balance is very important to ensure well-being. Now, when we experience stress, whether it's an external stressor or something that's going on inside the mind, anxiety, depression, so an internal stressor, what happens is that homeostasis is disrupted. And so when we mount a stress response, when we experience a stress response, we kind of go off balance. Now, when that stressor goes away, we can find our balance again. However, if we keep mounting a stress response, if we keep experiencing the stress response each and every day, well, then finding that balance, rebalancing, finding homeostasis becomes a lot more difficult. And what happens is that some of our systems start to break down, they wear down. And then what happens is that we have poor health outcomes that may arise and may present themselves. So just to talk a bit about the stress response and what the acute stress response looks like. So here I have a picture of a big, nasty, roaring bear. And if you were on the street and you saw this bear, well, I think we would all probably have the same reaction, right? We would probably experience the emotion of fear, and we would probably, yell quite loudly and probably run away. This is what we call an absolute stressor, because this is a stressor that really does create threat to our survival. And so in order to survive this threat, in order to survive this stressor, we will mount a stress response. And so what this is called is the fight or flight response. Now, no matter who you are in this Zoom chat, we would all pretty much respond to this bear in the same way. And so what happens is that our brain encodes, our brain registers that there's this threat in front of us. And there's a part of the brain called the amygdala that's activated. And so the amygdala is our fear center of the brain. Now, the amygdala works with other parts of the brain and begins this really lovely orchestrated sort of chain reaction that starts with activation of two stress-sensitive systems, the SAM system and the HPA system. Now, I won't talk about these systems today, but what I do want to talk about are the changes that occur in the body when these systems are activated. So things like, and you can even imagine it, if you were faced with a stressor, there's an increase in your heart rate, there's an increase in your blood pressure, so there's this rise in your cardiovascular activity. Also, there's an increase in our metabolic activity, so there's energy and glucose that's sent to the muscles in our body so that we could fight or run away from the bear. We also have other changes that occur in the body, such as changes in digestion. So our digestive system shuts down and our reproductive system shuts down, because these two systems are not necessary to survive this stressor, to survive the threat of this bear. Now, we all have this fight or flight response. We're all very capable of mounting a stress response, and it's very adaptive because it ensures our survival when faced with these very challenging and very dangerous situations. However, in the context of COVID-19, we're not facing a big growling bear anymore. So COVID-19 it's presenting a time of uncertainty, and within a very short period of time, we've been forced to really change our lives as we know it. And so even though the pandemic itself, we could say that this is a time of uncertainty and a stressor, our individual experiences of COVID-19 looks quite different. So, for example, some of us may be facing financial stress or job insecurity, and Dr. Antony actually already talked about many of the stressors that we may be experiencing during this time. So, another thing is, decreasing activities or not engaging in activities that were once very important to us and meaningful for us, such as going to the community center, going to the library, perhaps going to the gym. And so perhaps we're no longer able to engage in certain activities that were very meaningful. Another thing is that due to physical distancing, perhaps those who live alone in a house or apartment may feel a sense of social isolation. And on the other extreme, perhaps if you're living in an intergenerational household, there's interpersonal conflict because, again, within a space, there might be tensions that arise. Also, very simple things such as grocery shopping can now be perceived as very stressful in some individuals. And I say some individuals because, again, our perception, and Dr. Antony also spoke about this, was that our perception of our external world differs from one person to another. So for some people, going grocery shopping can be very stressful, and for others, it's not stressful at all. The problem is that our brain and our body does not recognize the difference between the big angry bear and the hassles and perhaps tensions and conflict and discomfort that we experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic. So what happens is that rather than having this activation for survival, we're activating our stress response systems perhaps a few times every day. And so what happens is that through chronic activation of our stress response system, our systems can wear down. And there is a lot of research to show that chronic activation of our stress-sensitive systems actually lead to stress-related health disorders. And so negative health outcomes of the body and mind have been reported in the literature, including an increased risk for cardiovascular disease, digestive problems, perhaps infertility, compromised immune system. And we know that at this time, our immune system, the strength of our immune system is very important to ensure that we don't contract the virus. Also, there can be chronic pain, poor sleep, depression. Metabolic disorders may also arise, such as type 2 diabetes, through chronic activation of our stress-sensitive systems. Also, there's an increased risk for cognitive impairment and dementia due to the impact that chronic levels of stress hormones may have on the brain. And finally, cellular aging has also been associated with chronic stress exposure. Now, this is a limited list, and the list can get a little longer, but I think it's really important to, looking at this list to suggest that stress management and really understanding how to manage our stress, and I'm not saying reduce our stress because we cannot get rid of the stressors in our lives. However, we can manage our stress, and we can change our relationship to those stressors in our lives. Now, I always tell all of my students that there are two things they have to know before they even think about stress management. The first is bringing awareness to the body and when stress arises in the body and recognizing that. And the second piece is to be able to identify the ingredients to their stress. Now, over 20 years of research, scientists have found 4 particular ingredients that may lead to the perception of stress. And you only need one of these ingredients in order to mount a stress response. So together, these 4 ingredients spell the word stun. The first is sense of control is low. The second is threat to ego, unpredictability, and novelty. So in the context of COVID-19, we could kind of look at each of these ingredients. And for the most part, all of them may arise within this context of a pandemic. So the first is that sense of control is low. We have no control over this pandemic. There is nothing that we could do in terms of problem solving to include that you as an individual can directly abolish this pandemic. So we do not have any direct control over the pandemic. With respect to threat to ego, so this is where you feel as if there is some negative evaluative threat. And that negative evaluation may come externally, but it could also come from, it could also come internally. So we are usually our worst critic, and we're very self-critical. We're very self-judgmental. So this ingredient can look very different for all of us. And so, for example, not being able to support or care for your loved ones, and this could be financial support or caring for a loved one, say who lives in a long-term care facility. Not being able to, let me just say, perhaps living in a multi-generational household and learning how to manage time with parents and children. And when it comes to children, a lot of parents now have been asked to homeschool their children. So a lot of parents are feeling perhaps a little inadequate and not sure if they're equipped to be able to homeschool their children. And so again, there might be some sort of evaluation going on, a negative evaluation where you feel as if you're being judged. Also, there might be some feelings of being targeted due to age or due to race or ethnicity during this pandemic. And so again, this threat to ego, I'd have to say that next to the sense of control being low, threat to ego is probably one of the most potent ingredients that will lead to a stress response. The third ingredient is unpredictability. And again, as we always say during this pandemic, is that this is a time of uncertainty. So we cannot predict the future. And a lot of people want to know, when will life go back to normal or whatever normal was? And will it be a few months from now? Will it be a year from now? And so this unpredictability creates a lot of tension, a lot of discomfort for many people, which then will lead to mounting a stress response. And the final piece, or the final ingredient, is novelty. And so I'm quite sure that this is the first time that all of us here are managing this pandemic. This is the first time that we're faced with this particular virus. And for many of us, it's perhaps the first time where we've been asked to really change our lives completely from how we usually lead our lives. So again, we could think about these ingredients in the context of the pandemic, in the context of COVID-19, but we can also apply these ingredients to those individual hassles or conflicts or tensions that we might experience every day. And what's important to know is that you only need one of these ingredients, and the more ingredients you have, it's likely the more potent the stress response will be, and perhaps a little more difficult to recover from if we do not use adaptive coping strategies. So one thing that's important to know is that although we do not have control over the situation, we usually have control over our response. And so we like to say that stress is in the eye of the beholder, much like love. Stress is in the eye of the beholder. And so even Dr. Antony had talked about this, if you were startled in the middle of the night, one person might respond with anger, another person might respond with fear, and then a third person might respond by just thinking, oh, it's nothing, I'll go back to sleep. So again, our perception, there are individual differences in our perception. Now, again, although we have no control over many situations that occur in our lives, such as this pandemic, we also don't have control over other people's behavior. We do have control over our own response. We have some agency over our perception and evaluation. And if anything, we could also perhaps change our relationship to that situation. And so this is where we can move into coping. And so within the field of psychology and the coping literature, there are two broad categories of coping strategies that we may try to employ. The first are problem-focused coping strategies. And these coping strategies are very adaptive. They work very well if you have direct control, if you can directly change the situation. Then problem-focused coping strategies such as problem solving, this is wonderful and it works. However, in the context of a situation where you have no control, such as this pandemic, problem-focused coping can actually be maladaptive and hurtful in some cases. And so perhaps in these cases where we have no direct control, emotion-focused coping is another strategy that we can use. And there are a number of different types of emotion-focused coping strategies. And again, these are strategies where you change your evaluation of the situation or your relationship to that situation. And so Dr. Antony sort of talked about some of this, and so there's some cognitive restructuring that we could engage in. But this is also where the cultivation of mindfulness may come in as a skill that we could develop in order to manage our stress response. So why practice mindfulness meditation during this pandemic and even outside of this pandemic? Well, the practice of mindfulness meditation helps us cultivate the skill to respond in the face of stress. So up to this point, I've been talking about stress reactivity, and that's sort of an automatic reaction that we'll have to a stressor. So if there's a stimulus, in this case, there's a stimulus, and that stimulus will be a stressor, and then we have an automatic reaction, that fight or flight response. And sometimes that fight or flight response is meaningful, it's adaptive, such as, in the context of danger, but in the context of interpersonal, perhaps, mild conflict, or some discomfort or frustration, having to stand in a line and being near other people, perhaps who are not social distancing or physical distancing, perhaps it's not very adaptive. So in this case, we can bring in the practice of mindfulness to change our relationship to the situation, and rather than reacting, taking a mindful pause and responding in a more skillful way. So what does mindfulness meditation entail? So mindfulness meditation it stems from traditional Buddhist teachings, and it was first introduced as a program, mindfulness-based stress reduction. It was introduced as a program by John Kabat-Zinn in the 1970s. And so this is a secularized program, and it really does not matter what your religious background is. Really, anyone can practice this. And there are a lot of elements that we can find in some traditional Chinese practices, such as Qigong and Tai Chi. So mindfulness, let's first define mindfulness. Mindfulness is the skill of paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, with an accepting attitude. And in brackets here, I have listed the 3 pillars of mindfulness: intention, attention, and attitude. And I'll talk a bit more about that on the next slide. Now, meditation is how we cultivate the skill. So the skill is mindfulness, and meditation is how we can formally practice this skill. And it is a skill that we need to formally practice. Because like any other skill, if you do not consistently practice, then you can never really develop that skill. It's as if you wanted to learn how to play the piano well, you have to practice every day. If you want to learn how to play the flute, you have to play every day. If you want to learn tennis, probably get where I'm going here. And over here I have a translated copy of Full Catastrophe Living, which is essentially talks about MBSR and the practice of mindfulness meditation. Now, importantly, we do not meditate to get good at meditating. What's important is that we do this every day to develop the skill. And I always tell my students that, it doesn't matter how long you could sit on a meditation cushion. It doesn't matter how perfect your mindful movements look. If you cannot take the skill off of the meditation cushion, if you cannot take it into your daily life, then the meditation in itself is somehow lost and needs to be developed. And there's a wonderful quote by Sharon Salzberg, who is perhaps the queen of compassion meditation, who said that we don't meditate to get better at meditating, we meditate to get better at life. So I'd like to now just talk about those 3 pillars of mindfulness. And so the first being intention. So this is how we start to cultivate mindfulness. So with intention, we set an intention every day to engage in self-care behaviors and to cultivate the skill of mindfulness. And so really what we're doing is we are setting an intention. How do I want to live my life? And so it really is aligning your actions with your morals and how you want to live your life. And so self-care is usually part of that. I want to be well. I want to be happy. I want to be at peace. And so with those intentions, we then move into the practice. And this is really kind of the opposite of our doing mode that we're usually in. We're usually always acting, in doing mode, kind of checking off our to-do list, and never or rarely do we kind of just stop and just take stock of what's going on right now in this moment. And so that's when attention comes in, and this is our second pillar of mindfulness. And so what we're doing here is we're focusing attention on present moment experiences, moment to moment experiences as they come and go, by attending to an anchor. And the anchor could really be anything. The easiest anchor is our breath. The easiest anchor is our breath. Sorry, I'm just going to mute someone. But that anchor could be other things. So Dr. Antony talked about, perhaps for some people focusing on the breath creates discomfort. Well, we could also explore that discomfort, but again, you could focus on the breath, you could focus on sound, you could focus on sensations in the body, but the breath is usually the easiest anchor point to present moment experiences. So we essentially just focus on the breath, we place our attention on the breath, and notice the in-breath, the out-breath, the spaces in between each breath. And every time that the mind goes away, is pulled away from the breath, we know where it has gone to and we bring it back. And we kind of have this squirrel mind where our mind likes to go off quite often. I mean, our attention will be pulled away from the breath multiple times in a 5-minute practice. But still, that is the practice of mindfulness. It's noting when our attention goes off and then bringing back. And so through this very simple practice, what we're doing is we're practicing attentional control. And by practicing attentional control, we're actually changing the brain. Experience changes the brain, meditation changes the brain. And so we are strengthening connections in the brain that are important for sustained attention, that are important for executive function, and as well that are important for emotion regulation, which is very important when we're trying to manage our stress. So what we're doing here through this practice with our attention and our engaged focus is that we're developing a calm and clear mind so that when we're feeling a little overwhelmed, we're able to provide space for it, and we're able to perhaps manage it a little more skillfully. The third pillar is attitude. And so of the three pillars, this is perhaps the most important of the three, because we can focus our attention on negative thoughts. We could focus our attention on depression. We could ruminate. We can focus our attention on worries. We could focus our attention on anger, on jealousy. And so if we focus our attention on depression, on anxiety, then that is what will grow. So what we do in the practice of mindfulness is with each experience, as each experience comes and goes, we welcome them all. So we create space for all experiences, whether they are positive, neutral, or negative. And so by bringing these attitudes of mindfulness, such as curiosity, accepting, patience, non-judgment, letting be, what we're doing is we're cultivating equanimity. We're cultivating a calm mind. And with the calm mind comes a calm body. And what we're doing is we're learning to be with what is, with whatever is present. And the reason why is because, well, whatever is present is already there. So rather than resisting it, which actually causes more suffering and more stress, we are learning to simply be with the discomfort and learning how to work with the discomfort. Now, research has shown that there are a lot of benefits associated with the practice of mindfulness. And here's just a short list, including decreasing stress and depression. It's been found to improve sleep, chronic pain, blood pressure. It's been found to improve immune function and cognitive processing that are associated with attentional control. It's also been found to improve physiological markers of stress. So the practice of mindfulness meditation can actually help us manage our stress response so that we're not as reactive every day. Also, research shows, as I said before, that the practice of mindfulness meditation actually changes the brain. So research has shown that after the practice of mindfulness meditation, we have an increase in alpha waves. And this is a sort of an indication of having that calm mind. It's also been found to increase the volume of the hippocampus, which is an important structure of the brain that's implicated in learning and memory, also is implicated in the stress response. Mindfulness meditation has also been shown to increase activity of the prefrontal cortex, which is essential for executive functioning, and the anterior cingulate cortex, which is essential for emotion regulation. It's also been shown to change the connectivity between different parts of the brain that are associated with stress reactivity, thus helping to dampen the brain. So the practice of mindfulness meditation changes the brain. So now what I'd like to do is to come back to those ingredients of stress. So our stun model of stress. And we could think about how can we bring the attitudes of mindfulness to our ingredients of stress. And so the first is sense of control is low. And so in this case, sense of control is low. So it's important to really be honest with what you can and cannot control. So there's no control, no direct control over the pandemic or other people's behavior for the most part. However, what we can control is our own behavior. So we can choose to engage in our civic duties, to maintain physical distancing when possible, or to wear a mask when we cannot maintain the physical distance. And we can also choose to engage in self-care behaviors, to set that intention every day to engage in self-care behaviors. The second ingredient, threat to ego. So in this case, perhaps noticing the judging mind, right? So noticing perhaps that internal dialogue, that self-judgment. And so noticing the judging mind and bringing compassion to present moment experiences. So for example, if you're unable to exercise or eat properly, rather than judging the self and perhaps engaging in negative self-talk, perhaps practicing a bit of self-compassion. And also to remember that the judgment is not reality, that these thoughts that we have are not reality. They are simply judgments, they are simply thoughts. And so really just to observe them from a distance. And we'll do this in our final practice. The third ingredient, unpredictability. So in this case, bring attention to the present moment. Rather than focusing on when will things get back to normal, when will things get back to normal, and really being focused on the future, bring attention to the present moment. And set an intention to ask, how do you want to live your life in this moment? Because the present moment is really the only moment we have for change. It's the only moment that we have agency in, and it's the only moment where we have for healing. The past is already the past. We do not know what we have in store for the future, so the present moment is really the moment that we have to work with. And the final ingredient is novelty. And with this ingredient in the context of COVID-19, I say trust in the self, and trust that you are an adaptable being. We've all managed some sort of uncertainty. We've all managed stressors, and we've all survived it. So just trusting in the self that we're able to adapt. And again, remembering that if there's one certainty in life, it's this. It's that of impermanence, right? Everything is always changing. And so knowing that this too shall pass. So in my final slide here, or second to last slide, I'd like to actually just provide you with some practical steps in how we can bring mindfulness to our daily lives at any point of the day. You could do this multiple times in a single day. And so we call this FACE, so F-A-C-E, and we could talk about facing COVID, if you will. So we'll begin with F. And actually, you've probably been staring at a screen for very long, so I do invite you, if you like, to rest your eyes, close your eyelids if that's comfortable for you, and perhaps go through this very short practice with me. So the first is to focus on what you have control over. So when experiencing some conflict or perhaps emotionally overwhelmed, what we can do is we could drop our anchor. Right? So we stop what we're doing and we drop our anchor, and the easiest anchor is usually the breath. And to follow the breath for a moment, noticing the in-breath and the out-breath, and the spaces in between. The next step is to acknowledge thoughts and feelings that are present in this moment. And some of those thoughts may be positive, some may be neutral, some may be negative. But what we're doing is we are creating space to allow all thoughts, all feelings, emotions to show up. And we're watching them as if we're a distant observer, as if we're watching clouds in the sky. And so, some clouds can be light and fluffy, some clouds can be dark and scary and a little rainy, but we're just kind of watching them pass by as they come and go. The next step is C, to come back into the body. So bringing awareness to sensations in the body, and perhaps grounding the feet. So noticing the sensations of the bottoms of the feet as they press down against the ground, as they connect you to the earth. And then bringing awareness to sensations of the breath as it moves through the body. And the last step is to then engage in what you're doing. So coming back to the room or to the space and to refocus on whatever you were doing, such as perhaps attending this talk. So again, you can engage in this practice at any point during the day, and the ACE component is something that you could go over and over again until there is some calm in the body. And so my final take-home points are this, is that the experience of stress during this pandemic is universal. This is something that we are all experiencing. Even though the experience may be a little different for each and every one of us, we still all experience stressors in our lives, especially during this pandemic. It's also important to recognize or to bring awareness to the stress in the body, and to be able to find those ingredients before actually considering to manage the stress. And also the last point is that through mindfulness meditation, we can build resilience in the face of uncertainty. And when I think of resilience, I think of the bamboo tree. I think of the bamboo tree, which is very hard, there's hardiness, there's a lot of strength, but at the same time it's very flexible. And so regardless of what the weather, if you bend it in any way, it will adapt. And so we could think of resilience much like the bamboo. So with that, I'll end, and I want to thank you for your attention and your time.
Thank you very much, Alex. And I will give a brief summary in Mandarin about what Alex taught us, a lot of meaningful and helpful information. So let me share my screen. Okay, so here is my 5-minute Chinese version, and let me show my screen. Oh, okay, here you are. 那在这个Alex 讲到的呢，就是说我们在疫情期间怎么样应对压力。那压力呢是无处不在，尤其是在这个疫情期间，我们非常的普遍。那我们怎么来应对压力呢？他讲到了这以下4点。第一点呢，他讲到我们在应激反应的时候，在应对压力的时候呢，我们的身体是出现一个失去平衡的状态。失去平衡呢，其实就是压力的一个主要的来源。那我们在压力的状态下，就好像看见一个 growing bear， 好像看见一头熊一样。那这时候呢，我们身体呢就会产生一个反应，或者是我们要 fight， 或者是要逃跑，或者要战斗。那这些如果要是长期的这样应激状态呢，就可能对我们的身体和心理呢都造成一定的伤害。那么我们要应对压力，首先要认识压力。认识压力呢，它讲的是有4个主要的元素，它叫 STAN system。那 STAN 呢，就是它代表呢一个就是这个 sense of control， 就是失控感，控制感呢比较低，我们对这个局势没有办法控制。还有呢，对自我造成了威胁。还有就是不可预测性，不知道这个将会发生什么。还有就是它新颖性，所以呢 COVID-19 呢，我们这4个方面的特征都满足，所以呢，我们有压力，有这个失控的感觉是非常正常的。那我们也许对我们的所处的这个局势，就像这个疫情一样，我们没有办法掌控，但是通常呢，我们可以控制我们如何去反应。就像在同一件事情里头呢，不同的人可能给出不同的解释，那我们的反应也不一样，那不同的人可能产生的这个压力的反应也不一样。那在应对压力的时候呢，我们一般情况下呢有2种方式，一种呢就想办法扭转局势，就是解决问题。比如说这个有 COVID-19， 那我们就想办法来解决这个，但是这个好像解决起来不是那么现实。另外一种方法就是情绪导向。那我们既然没有办法改变疫情，也没有办法呢让它立马停止，那我们就可以改变我们对这个疫情的一个评估，或者对疫情的一个情绪的反应，可以呢通过管理情绪来进行应对。那这个情绪导向的这种 coping 呢，就是我们下面要谈的正念它的一个基本的一个基础。那他所提到的一个很简单的 practice， 可能大家也平时都在做呢，就是正念冥想。它可以帮助我们提高心理复原力。正念呢 mindfulness 它有4个元素。第一个呢就是目标，我们要有一个 intention 去每天有那么拿出一点的时间来，有这样的意图来做正念。那正念的第2个就是它的注意，那注意力要集中在当下的那个时间，而不是过去停留在将来我还要干什么事儿，很多的这个想法。那你的注意力要集中在当下。还有第3方面就是它的态度，你要有一个接纳的态度，就不管任何事情发生在这一个 moment， 那我们都保持一个接纳和平定淡定的一种心态，这就是一个态度。那冥想呢，就是帮助我们可以达到正念的这样一个技巧的一种方式。那我们要冥想的，有的时候呢，我自己呢，就是说有的时候很难冥想，因为脑子里的事情太多，所以呢，就是说，一旦冥想的时候非常的努力。他刚才讲了一个很好的，就是说我们其实冥想的不是说我们练习冥想是为了更好的冥想，而是我们冥想的是为了更好的生活。这个是我们放松的。如果我们特别努力去冥想，也冥想不出来，自己又 frustrated， 那其实对你是没有太大的帮助。那最后一个简单的练习关于控制压力呢，就是叫FACE 这样一个 model。那它包括这4个方面。第一个呢，就是我们既然很多不可控的因素，那我们就关注一下这里边有什么样是可控的。比如说我们可能管不了别人怎么样出门带不带 mask 呀，可能管不了别人是不是遵守2米的社交距离呀，那这些我们不可以控制。但是我们想想什么是我们可以控制的，比如说我们可以控制我们自己的这个行为方式，我们 make sure 呢我们自己出门带 mask。 mask， 我们 make sure 呢，我们自己跟别人保持2米的距离。还有第二个呢，就是 acknowledgement， 我们承认，当我们有这个紧张了，当我们觉得特别的有压力，那我们就承认我们有这样的想法，承认我们自己的感受。那这就是说是我们要认识它，同时呢，我们要回到我们的身体来，跟自己的身体呢建立一个密切的连接，来有一个觉察性，觉得我们的身体是什么样的状态呢？是放松的还是僵硬的？最后呢，就是要 engage， 就是投入到我们目前所做的一些活动来。就像 Dr. Antony 也讲到，其实我们投入到一定的活动里边，而不是无所事事呢，这是可能是更好、更积极的一种应对压力的方式。这就是 Dr. Fiocco 的报告。那It's my great pleasure to introduce our third